All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're breaking down a really powerful speech by Muivah, who's the chief negotiator for the National Socialist Council of Nagalim, the NSCN. His words take us right to the heart of the 79-year-old Indo-Naga political conflict, and, maybe more importantly, they reveal exactly why a huge peace agreement, one that everyone thought was the final solution, has now completely ground to a halt. This one line from Muivah's speech really just captures the entire spirit of the Naga national movement. For them, it's not about one person's lifetime or even one generation. It's about this permanent, enduring idea of a nation. And keeping that long-term view in mind is absolutely crucial to understanding everything else we're about to talk about.
So how did we even get to this point? Well, this isn't some new problem. As Muivah lays it out, this has been a struggle that's gone on for nearly 80 years. And it's all rooted in a really fundamental disagreement about sovereignty and national identity.
At the absolute center of this whole conflict is the idea of Nagalim. Now, this isn't just a random piece of land. From the Naga perspective, Nagalim is a sovereign territory, one given to them by God, sitting at this incredibly strategic point. This idea, that their homeland is divinely granted and was never conquered, it's the very bedrock of their entire political fight.
What's so interesting here is you can see the whole journey unfold. It goes from a political declaration to decades of armed conflict and then finally to the negotiating table. So in 1947, you have the Nagas declaring independence. 4 years later, in 51, a plebiscite backs that up. What follows are decades of really violent conflict. You have these moments like the 1982 ambush and the 1987 Onam incident that become these defining points of resistance and, well, alleged human rights abuses. The real turning point, though, comes in 1997. A ceasefire is called, and this long war moves from the jungles to the conference room.
Yeah, that 1997 ceasefire really kicks off a whole new chapter. Both sides basically said, okay, let's find a political solution. And that led to a formal peace process between the government of India and the NSCN. But, and this is a big but, the conditions for these talks were very, very specific.
These three principles are just so important. According to Muivah, these conditions were a fundamental admission by India that this wasn't just some internal law and order problem they could handle. Think about it. Unconditional talks at the prime ministerial level and held outside India. In his view, that setup placed both sides on an equal footing, and it recognized the conflict for what they believed it was, a conflict between two sovereign peoples.
And this is where we see the first huge breakthrough, the Amsterdam Joint Communiqué in 2002. Now, for the NSCN, that phrase, unique history and situation, was a total game changer. Muivah sees this as India officially admitting that Nagalim was never part of the Indian Union by choice, and it wasn't conquered either.
So all of this builds up to the biggest milestone in the whole 28-year peace process, the Framework Agreement, which was signed back in 2015. This was supposed to be it, the blueprint for a final, lasting solution.
So what exactly is the Framework Agreement? Well, you can think of it like a preamble, right? It's a foundational document signed by both sides that lays out the big principles that a final, more detailed agreement would be built on. It was called historic. This was supposed to be the path to ending one of the longest-running insurgencies in all of Asia.
Okay, so from Muivah's point of view, the agreement gives up a lot of ground. It recognizes that Naga sovereignty lies with the Naga people themselves, and it introduces this pretty radical idea of sharing sovereign power. Here's the key takeaway he stresses. If you recognize a people's sovereignty, then logically you have to recognize their symbols of sovereignty, right? And that means a national flag and a constitution. He argues this is the whole basis for a new relationship that exists outside the current Indian constitution.
For a little while there, it really seemed like a solution was right around the corner. But as we know, years have passed, and there's no final deal. Instead, we have an impasse, a complete deadlock that has just frozen the entire process. And that brings us to the big question of this whole explainer, doesn't it? After all that conflict, all that progress, why did everything just stop? What could possibly be so important that it would risk throwing away decades of work toward peace?
Well, the answer comes down to two things: the Naga national flag and a Naga constitution, or Yezebo. For the NSCN, these aren't just symbols, not at all. They are the living, breathing embodiment of the sovereignty and unique history that they believe the Framework Agreement itself recognizes.
This slide just breaks down the deadlock so clearly. On one side, you have Muivah arguing, look, the Framework Agreement recognizes our sovereignty, so it logically follows that our flag and constitution are part of that. They're non-negotiable. But on the other side, he alleges, the government of India is insisting that any solution has to be within the Union of India, and is flat out refusing to recognize these symbols. So in his view, they've betrayed the entire spirit of the agreement they signed.
So this deadlock has led to a really dangerous moment in the peace process. In his speech, Muivah kind of shifts gears from explaining the past to issuing a really stark warning about the future, and it's full of accusations of betrayal.
And these accusations are pretty severe, claiming the government of India hasn't just betrayed the agreement, but that it's actively trying to sabotage it by trying to divide the Naga people, by spreading a twisted version of what the agreement says, and ultimately by showing zero real political will to actually get it done.
And here is the really chilling consequence of that alleged betrayal. This quote is a direct warning. Muivah is basically saying that the actions of the Indian government are deliberately pushing the situation away from the negotiating table and right back toward armed conflict.
And through all of these warnings, their core position hasn't budged an inch. If anything, it's gotten harder. The message is crystal clear. The Naga National Flag and Constitution are not bargaining chips. To them, they're the very essence of Naga identity and sovereignty, and they are not going to give them up.
So that leaves us with this massive, critical question. You've got a historic agreement designed to end a 79-year conflict, and it's completely stalled over symbols that represent sovereignty itself. With trust shattered and warnings of a return to the battlefield, you have to wonder, is the fate of a peace that's held for nearly 3 decades now hanging by a thread?